I was standing in my driveway, coffee still warm in my hand, when I learned that my HOA was trying to take my home, slap me with $1 million fine, and erase 3 generations of my family in a single certified letter. By the time the sun set that day, I honestly believed I might lose everything I'd ever known. What I didn't realize yet was that the HOA had just picked a fight on land they never truly owned. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick, stiff, and important-looking, in that way that makes your stomach tighten before you even open it. I almost tossed it on the passenger seat of my truck with the rest of the junk mail. Almost. Then I saw the return address. Pinecrest Meadows Homeowners Association. I tore it open right there in my driveway, steam from my coffee curling up into my face. Halfway through the first paragraph, my fingers went numb. By the time I reached the number at the bottom, my mug slipped out of my hand and shattered on the concrete. $1,247,500. That was the total amount the HOA claimed I owed in fines. According to the letter signed neatly by HOA President Linda Vasquez, I had been in continuous violation of 17 separate HOA covenants for more than 5 years. Unauthorized exterior paint, unapproved landscaping, excessive vehicle parking. Each violation carried a fine of $500 per day. They had added it all up, slapped on penalties, and were now threatening to place a lien on my property. Foreclosure was mentioned casually like an afterthought. I just stood there staring at the paper, the numbers blurring, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Here's the thing. I don't live in the HOA. I never have. My house sits on 3 acres at the very edge of Pinecrest Meadows, right at the entrance. My grandfather built this place in 1967, long before anyone ever dreamed of manicured lawns matching mailboxes or laminated rule books. When a developer bought the surrounding land decades later and built Pinecrest Meadows, my family refused to sell. We were here first, and we intended to stay. I never signed HOA covenants. I never attended HOA meetings. As far as I was concerned, their rules ended at my fence line. Apparently, Linda Vasquez saw things differently. For 3 years, she'd been sending me violation notices. At first, I laughed them off. My house has its original 1960s ranch style. The paint isn't trendy. My grandfather's old pickup truck sits in the driveway, engine rebuilt more times than I can count. I grow vegetables in my front yard because I always have. Linda didn't like any of it. She said it was an eyesore. She said it hurt property values. I ignored her letters, confident that an HOA had no authority over a property that predated the HOA itself. Standing there with that $1 million notice in my hand, I started to wonder if I'd been dangerously wrong. I went inside and called my attorney, Richard Morrison, the moment I could steady my voice. "Richard," I said, "they're saying I owe over $1 million in HOA fines." There was a long pause on the other end. "You're not in the HOA," he said slowly. "You never signed anything." "That's what I thought," I replied, my throat tight. "But they're threatening a lien. Foreclosure." Another pause. "Email me the letter. Don't respond to them. Don't sign anything. I'll look into this immediately." 2 hours later, Richard called back, and his voice was tight with anger. He told me something that made my blood run cold. Linda Vasquez had filed a lawsuit 3 years earlier claiming my property was part of the development because it shared an access road with Pinecrest Meadows. She argued that since I benefited from HOA-maintained infrastructure, I was subject to HOA rules. The case went through without me ever knowing. Court notices were sent to an old address pulled from outdated records. I never showed up because I never knew. Linda won by default. A judge signed off on it. On paper, she had authority over my land. I sank down onto my couch, the letter still clutched in my hand. "How is that even possible?" I asked. Richard exhaled slowly. "It looks deliberate," he said. "She used an outdated address. The judge never heard your side." My mind spiraled. A technicality, a lie. And suddenly my family home was at risk. For the first time in my life, I felt truly powerless. That night, I didn't sleep. I paced the house my grandfather built, running my hand along the walls he'd painted himself, staring at photos of him standing in this same driveway, proud and smiling. I asked myself questions I never thought I'd ask. Maybe I should sell. Maybe I was wrong to stand my ground all these years. Maybe fighting the HOA was impossible. They had lawyers' money and now apparently a court judgment. I felt small-cornered, like the system itself was leaning on my chest, daring me to breathe. The next morning, Richard asked me to come to his office. He spread faded documents across his desk, deeds and maps that smelled like old paper and dust. "I pulled your property records going back to 1962, he said. "Your grandfather owned more than 3 acres. He pointed to a map. 17 acres. The entire area where Pinecrest Meadows now stood. In 1989, my grandfather sold 14 acres to a development company. But he didn't sell everything. There was a clause in the sale agreement, a clause no one had paid attention to in decades. Seller retains perpetual easement rights," Richard read aloud, tracing the words with his finger. "Over all access roads, all common areas. Any homeowners association formed must obtain written consent from the seller for exclusive use of those areas." I stared at him, not fully understanding yet. "What does that mean?" I asked. Richard smiled, slow and sharp. "It means your grandfather sold the land, but he kept the rights to the roads and common areas. And when the HOA formed years later, they never got permission from your family." The room felt suddenly too quiet. "My grandfather died in 2003, I said. "I inherited everything." Richard nodded. "Including this easement." "Marcus, you don't just own your 3 acres. You own the legal rights to every road, sidewalk, playground, and clubhouse in Pinecrest Meadows." It hit me all at once. Linda had claimed I benefited from their roads. In reality, they'd been benefiting from ours. Roads my grandfather built in 1965. Roads they'd been using without proper authorization for 15 years. For the first time since opening that letter, my fear cracked. In its place came something else. Resolve. Richard laid out the plan. First, we'd file a motion to vacate the fraudulent judgment. Then we'd sue Linda personally for abuse of process. And finally, we'd send the HOA a formal notice revoking their access rights unless they met certain conditions. Drop the fines. Issue a formal apology. Linda resigns. "You can evict the entire HOA from your land if you want to," Richard said calmly. I sat back in my chair, heart racing, and nodded. "Let's do it." The response was immediate and explosive. Linda called me directly, her voice shaking with rage. She accused me of extortion, threatened me with arrest, demanded I back down. I stayed calm. I told her the facts, told her those roads were my family's, told her she'd crossed a line. She hung up on me without another word. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Saturday at the community clubhouse. The irony wasn't lost on me. The clubhouse sat on land covered by my grandfather's easement. Richard advised me not to attend, but I went anyway. I wanted to see it, to watch the moment Linda's authority finally cracked. The room filled with confused, angry residents clutching copies of the documents Richard had sent out in advance. Linda tried to spin the story, painting me as a hostile neighbor holding the community hostage. Then people started standing up. A real estate attorney who lived down the street confirmed the easement was valid. A neighbor called Linda out for manufacturing violations. Another accused her of fraud. The room turned on her fast. I stood up, then my voice steadied despite the adrenaline flooding my system, and told them the truth. About the lawsuit, the fake address, the $1 million fine meant to scare me off my own land. Linda's face turned red. She tried to talk about property values, about order, about rules. No one was listening anymore. The vote was unanimous. She was removed as HOA president on the spot. The fines were dropped. An apology was ordered. Linda didn't look at me as she gathered her papers and walked out. The legal fallout came fast. Linda was sued personally for fraud and abuse of process. She settled. She resigned from the HOA entirely. Within 3 months, she sold her house and left Pinecrest Meadows. I never saw her again. The new HOA president came by my house a week later with a bottle of wine and a handwritten apology. He admitted they'd trusted Linda without question, that they'd been wrong. I accepted it quietly. The house stayed the same, the garden stayed, the truck stayed. The HOA reformed its policies, and the roads remained open this time with proper permission. Standing in my yard weeks later, watering tomatoes in the afternoon sun, I thought about how close I'd come to losing everything because someone with a clipboard thought authority was the same as legitimacy. It isn't. Authority without consent is just bullying, and sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to stand your ground on the truth.